As I said earlier, today is the common growing season, as we call it, or ordinary time. And so what that means is that there's a big transition in the service. So you might have noticed there was only 2 readings instead of 3. Well, I guess it was 3. But normally there's 4. I don't always read the gospel. And so we usually have 3, and then the gospel usually gets read during the service, or the sermon. Well, now that we're in ordinary time, the readings don't really correspond. And so during most of Advent and then Lent and Easter, during those seasons, all 4 readings kind of go together. And so often what I do is we kind of try to bring those ideas together in the sermon. But now we're in ordinary time, and so the first reading, the Old Testament reading, is kind of independent. And then the Psalm is a response to the Old Testament reading. And then there's a New Testament reading, which we did not read today, and then the Gospel. And they're all kind of independent, and they're all just kind of on a track through the whole summer. And so we're only doing the 2 readings and then the Gospel, and then I am going to be preaching from a completely different book. This is what we typically do. Either we'll preach from a book, or we might do something like look at, there was one year I did the Sermon on the Mount, but this time we're doing a book. And the book we're going to be working on is a book that has captivated humans for generations. So much so that this book, or the story in this book, has not been made into 1 or 2, but at least 3 blockbuster movies. Maybe some of you have seen some of those movies. There's a lot more movies out there about this book that are not well known, but there's 3 that, where millions of dollars are spent on them, and they were huge productions. 3. And this is the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And so this is a story we're going to be looking at for the summer. If you didn't know, the story of Moses comes to us from the Old Testament book of Exodus. So that is the second book in the Old Testament. So there's Genesis, which is book 1, and then you have Exodus, which is book 2. And Exodus is the story of Moses in Israel. So that starts on page 78 in the Pew Bible. So we're going to be looking at this story for the summer. It's 40 chapters, and what that means is that we're not going to be looking at every chapter individually. There might be chapters later on that we completely skip, or we just look at a couple of verses from, and we'll have to kind of bring some of those chapters together and look from a really high level. So that's what we're planning to do for the summer. There is in the works a conversation about having a Bible study to go with it. I would think that will happen. It has not been completely finalized. That's why I can't tell you for sure. But I know it's something that we want to do, and it's just we need to get dates on the calendar and make sure we have books picked out to work through it. But that's what we'd like to be able to do this year. So we're going to be going through Exodus, and we're going to start in Exodus chapter 1. So if you want to follow along in the Pew Bible, or today it will be on the screen if you want to follow along. So let's take a look at how this book opens. Exodus chapter 1. So these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now this might seem like a very lame opening to a book, and I understand that we're used to reading books that have a really good opening first chapter, because you have to have a good opening chapter if you're going to capture someone's attention. Now this book is not that way, but that's because Exodus is actually a sequel in a sense. Or it's like the original Star Wars, which was supposed to be 3 movies, a trilogy, and you had 3 movies to tell the story. Now Exodus is a 1 of 5. It's number 2 in that 1 of 5. There's 5 books that tell the story from Genesis and then Abraham's family to them getting ready to go into the promised land. There's 5 books, the first 5 books of the Bible. And so these opening lines tell the reader, hey, remember Israel, who is Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham. So Abraham had a son named Isaac. We had a couple sons, but Isaac then had Jacob. And then there's a story about Jacob wrestling with God. It's a weird story in Genesis. And then he gets renamed Israel. And so we saw today in our psalm, there was a couple places where it said Israel, sons of Jacob. Well, that's because he has two names. And we see both names here. We see the sons of Israel, then we see Jacob, and then here we see Jacob. That can be confusing. But these are the sons of Jacob, who are the sons of Isaac, the sons of Abraham. And so that's who this story is about. And at the end of Genesis, that family ends up in Egypt. And so why were they in Egypt? Well, if you remember, the 12 brothers here that are named, they were not the greatest guys. And then Joseph, one of their younger brothers, they ended up selling into slavery. He ended up in Egypt, and then there was a famine, and then Joseph became a really important leader in Egypt. And then his brothers came, and he gave them grain so they could live. And then they came to live with him in Egypt. And so the whole family moved from the promised land to Egypt because they had food, and that's where their brother was. And so that story right here, Exodus, is plugging into that story from Genesis. And so this is what's next. Verse 6, now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. So this is another connection, what the Bible Project calls hyperlink to Genesis. So we first learned that this story is about the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of his 12 sons, but all of that generation has died. And so it's later in the story. We also learned that they had been fruitful, which remember, Adam and Eve were told to be fruitful. And they were to fill the earth, and like the land was filled with them. So they are basically being blessed by God, and they are doing what God asked them to do. They are filling the earth. Now this takes us back to what God told Abraham. He said to Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis, he said, I want you to go to a land that I will show you, and in this land I will bless you, and you will have descendants that outnumber the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach. And from your family the nations will be blessed. And so God is being faithful to Israel, to Jacob's family, by multiplying them in Egypt. So much so that they fill the land. This is God's will, that his chosen family would fill the earth. And remember, it was to bless the nations. Why was it that why were they even in Egypt? Because when the family was in Egypt, Egypt was blessed. And now the family's grown. So we see at this point in the story that God has been faithful. He has done what he had promised to do for Abraham and his family. But remember, there was one piece of information about that promise. He said, this land that you're in, I'm going to show you, I will give to you. And it will be the land of your people. They are not in that land. They are in Egypt. And so there's this one question about them not being in the land, but they have multiplied. And this is when the story starts to turn. Verse 8. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So this is where the story takes a turn. So the Pharaoh, it says new king, which later on we hear the kings called pharaohs because that's what they were called. But a king comes to power who doesn't know Joseph. Now, one of the first questions that people start to ask when they're studying Exodus is, does Egyptian history tell us this king? Does Egyptian history talk about the Israelites? Can we look into the history and find out about this story? The answer is no. We don't know the king. They never named the king. There's theories out there about who this king could be and why he didn't know Joseph, or maybe why he chose to not honor the previous king's treatment of Joseph's family. Both those are probably options. Now, here's the reason there's nothing in history about it, most likely. We don't know for sure. But in the ancient world specifically, history was written by the king. You wrote your own history in the sense of absolutely you were in control of your history as an ancient king, but also you were in control of the people writing the story, because you would erect monuments to tell stories about things that happened. You would tell stories on public buildings, but you did not tell stories you did not want people to hear. And so the story of Exodus is not the kind of story that would be recorded in ancient history, because nothing about the people who write the story look good. Now, in today's world, we have independent historians who write no matter what any government says. They're doing research, they're trying to figure out original sources, they write those stories. That's not how it worked in the ancient world. And so we don't have the story from anywhere but Exodus. Now, the reason that the name isn't given, I think most likely it's because the name doesn't matter. This story is about a human king versus God. It could be any human king, not just the Pharaoh for the Egyptians. But also, there's a good chance that the people who knew the story originally knew who the Pharaoh was, so they didn't need to write it down. But we don't know exactly who it is, but this Pharaoh is going to try to stop the growth of Israel. And he wants to do this by stopping them somehow, because he sees them as a threat. So this is what he does. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them and with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. And so the first way that the Pharaoh thinks he's going to stop the growth of Israel is through slave labor, basically forced labor. He brings them to work for the government under forced labor, and they build a couple cities for him. And the hope is that if he just keeps them really busy and he takes away all of the things that they used to have as a special people, that they will not multiply like they were. That's his hope. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. So Pharaoh has a second try. Verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the boy is a boy, or the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. And so now Pharaoh's stepping up his game. He wants the midwives of the Hebrew women to remove any boy babies. Now, the reason he wants the boys is because they grow up to be soldiers. And this is how he's going to deal with the population problem. But this is what happens next. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And the midwives, because they feared God, he gave them families of their own. And so the midwives, who would have been Hebrew also, they somehow undermine Pharaoh's plan. Maybe they actually get word out and say, don't call us until it's time. Maybe it is true that the Egyptian and Hebrew women gave birth differently, and Hebrew women needed less help from midwives. We don't really know exactly how it worked out. But these midwives undermined Pharaoh's plan. And Pharaoh was not able to accomplish what he set out to do, to stop the growth of Israel. So he goes to his third and most sinister option, verse 22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. So now he says this to all of the Egyptians. "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." And so now he just turns to his people and basically says, "I want you to help remove the babies." This is an extreme attempt. And what's interesting is the story just kind of sits here. We don't hear anything else about what happens. We just know that Pharaoh issues this order. We don't know if the people follow it. We don't know if it works and if people are actually removing babies. Because now the story shifts. And we see from this first chapter, Egypt is not a safe place for God's people. But we see they're also stuck there. They're stuck in oppressed labor. They cannot get free. They are in this horrible place. God had been faithful and he had multiplied them, but his faithfulness only led to pain for Israel. So this is the big question. Will God save his people? Will he set them free? And so now we go to chapter 2. And this is what chapter 2 introduces to us. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. And she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And so now we have a story about a couple of Hebrew people. So the author tells us it's a Levi man and woman who marry. They're Levites. This is important because Levites later on in the story are going to be the ones who priests come from. And the baby that we're going to learn about is the ultimate priest. And so it's important that he comes from a priestly family. Next thing, this baby, when the mom sees the baby, she saw that he was a fine child. Okay, so this is just a bad translation. I mean, it's a fine translation for English, but what it does is it hides that the word tov is in there. Now, I talk about tov sometimes. Whenever God made creation, he looked at it and he said, it is tov, good. Tov means with order and purpose. It's the way God intended it. So this baby is good. That's a callback to Genesis. It's the way that God wanted things to be is this baby. And so what she does, and again, this is where English fails us. And when I learned this, I was blown away. So it says that she built a little paper boat for him out of papyrus baskets and coated it with tar. Is there a word in English? It just says basket, okay? It's not a basket. I mean, it is a basket. The word in Hebrew, though, is ark. She built him an ark. It uses the same word as Noah for a reason. Just like the ark was the vessel that God created to preserve his people, now Moses is placed into an ark. And it's going to save God's people. And so Moses, this little baby, gets put into this ark. And he's put amongst the weeds in the Nile River with the hope that he will have a better life. And this is what happens. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of those Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter. So this is Moses, the baby's sister who happened to be watching. She goes up to Pharaoh's daughter and says, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So the baby is discovered by none other than the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, whenever you watch the movies, they play this up like his other brother was, especially the animated one, his other brother was older, but he was in line to become the next Pharaoh. And so in the movie, the Pharaoh that he's dealing with is actually his adopted brother. There's nothing in this story for that. I'm sorry. Pharaoh could have had lots of daughters. We don't know if they ever interacted or any of these things. But what we do know is that still Pharaoh, remember, he wanted the Hebrew babies put in the Nile, the very source of his evil becomes the source of life for Israel. Because this baby is on the Nile and he's brought out of it in this ark. And his own household is going to raise the future liberator of Hebrew slaves. The irony in the way that God works. And in this first opening chapter, this is what we see. Even though Pharaoh tries to stand in the way of God blessing his people and blessing the world, nothing can stop God from saving his people. That's what we're going to see throughout this book. Remember, God said to Abraham, I'm going to use you to bless the nations. We just heard the Tower of Babel and how that story whenever humans got scattered. Well, how is God going to bring humans together again? Well, we just had Pentecost. We celebrated him bringing them together. But he had to get from Babel to Pentecost. Well, the first step was Abraham, and now Abraham's family needs to be saved. And nothing can stop God from saving his people. Pharaoh might believe that he is the most powerful human in the world. And Pharaoh did believe that at the time. Pharaoh would have called himself a god. He was the son of God. He was greater than any human in the world. But Moses is going to stand up to Pharaoh because nothing can stop God from saving his people. And this is what Exodus is all about. There will be many obstacles throughout the book. Pharaoh's the first one. But nothing can stop God from saving his people. This is an important message for several reasons. First, it points to Jesus. So before we get to Jesus, we have to get from Abraham to Jesus. And this is an important step along the way. This first step. And it reminds us that God would do nothing and nothing could stop him because of what he did with Jesus. The ultimate act of salvation. Nothing can stop God from saving his people. But this other reason is important because for us in life, we might find ourselves in difficult situations. We might be facing challenges. Life is hard. It doesn't always go the way we want. But we have hope because God will save us. And he has done the work to save the whole world because nothing can stop God from saving his people. And Exodus is one of those stories where we see that come to light. One of the first places in the Bible where we really see what we heard in Isaiah today, where in Isaiah God says, I came to a people who didn't ask for me, who didn't know me, and I saved them. Because whenever Moses meets God, he doesn't know who he is. He's like, okay, you want me to go save my people, who should I tell them you are? And we're going to find out what he says. Because God will not be stopped from saving his people. And so next week we get to enter this story and see how God acts to save his people.